And by the way, when has Israel ever said we accept Palestine's right to exist? And when are Israeli supporters ever called upon to say we accept Palestine's right to exist? Israel already exists. It has recognized borders that it doesn't even respect itself because it steals more Palestinian land and now destroys Gaza. Um, but no Israeli has ever challenged to say, do you accept Palestine's right to exist, even though Palestine doesn't exist yet and it's actually being destroyed right now.
Welcome back to The Tea, where we dig into the story behind the headlines. I'm your host, Myriam Francois. Before we get into this episode, I just want to take a tiny moment to ask you to do one thing for me, and that is to hit that subscribe button now. We're a small independent team, no big networks here, no corporate backing, just a handful of people who care deeply about having honest conversations and shining a light on what often goes unseen or unheard. So if our work does resonate with you too, then subscribe now on YouTube and join us on Patreon, link in our bio. Nearly 20 months into the genocide in Gaza, the repression of those daring to speak out has never been more blatant. In the UK, football legend turned broadcaster Gary Lineker is reportedly leaving the BBC because, well, let's be honest, for publicly supporting Palestinians. Across the Atlantic, beloved children's educator Miss Rachel is facing a coordinated hate campaign accused of spreading Hamas propaganda and even being investigated for supposed terrorist ties, all for the crime of humanizing Palestinian children. And meanwhile, not a single dual Israeli national who has served in Gaza has faced prosecution in the UK, despite mounting evidence of war crimes. Yet Mo Chara from Irish group Kneecap is now facing terrorism charges for holding a Hezbollah flag at a concert. The message, showing compassion for Palestinian lives, is relentlessly policed, while complicity in alleged atrocities goes unchecked. And it gets darker. The tragic murder of two Israeli staffers in DC sparks accusations of anti-Semitism and outrage, while the genocide and ongoing starvation of Palestinians gets endlessly debated, as if it's even up for discussion. This isn't just racism, it's deliberate disinformation. Weaponizing accusations of anti-Semitism to shield Israel from scrutiny doesn't silence dissent. It makes fighting real anti-Semitism harder and pushes justice for Palestinians even further away. But the narrative is shifting. After more than a year of gaslighting, even major media outlets are finally naming Israeli war crimes and occasionally platforming Palestinian voices. Is this a real reckoning or just legacy media trying to catch up with a public that's already disillusioned? To help us cut through the noise, I'm joined by Aaron Maté, award-winning journalist and host of Pushback at the Grey Zone. Aaron's reporting goes beyond the headlines, exposing the strategies behind media narratives and asking the questions others won't. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Great to be here on the T.
Thank you so much for being with us. Well, first of all, for those who are not completely familiar with your background, tell us a little bit about your family, how you grew up, the extent to which, so you were born and raised in Canada to Jewish parents, and you have previously spoken out about how uncritical support for Israel was sort of, part and parcel of growing up. Um, what made you start to question that narrative, and, look into things a little bit more deeply?
I was very influenced by my father, Gabor Maté. He's a author, doctor, well known, and he barely survived the Nazi Holocaust. He was born in Hungary, and shortly afterwards, the Nazis occupied Budapest, and he barely survived his first year of life. And so that genocide has shaped our whole family. And I grew up very much in the shadow of that. And from a young age, my dad, he was raised as a Zionist. He was part of a Zionist youth group. But in his early 20s, he had an awakening. He simply read books and he realized that everything he had been told was a lie about Israel and its foundations. This whole notion of a land without a people for a people without a land. So from a very young age, I was lucky to, as a North American Jewish person, to avoid the indoctrination that often comes with being in that situation. And one of my first political memories was when I was about 9 or 10 years old. My dad was in Palestine during the first Intifada as part of a medical delegation visiting to see the crackdown that was happening with Israel, using massive violence against a huge civil uprising against occupation. And I heard him on the radio weeping at what he was seeing. And so that was a very formative experience for me. And in terms of, avoiding all the propaganda trappings that come from being raised as Zionist. I never had that. Even though I was around the Zionist community, I actually went to a Zionist summer camp because it was a big part of our family's tradition, but I had the intellectual self-defense always with me to, push aside the Israeli propaganda. So I have a unique insight into how it works. Like, especially for Western Jews, there's this structure of summer camps and Sunday schools. And then, your formative memories, your friendships become associated with subconsciously this foreign state, which is portrayed to you as this safe haven. Of course, it's all a lie, but then that creates this emotional bond that's very hard for people to break, even as they become adults and even as they have all the access in the world to the facts. And luckily, I was able to avoid that.
It's interesting you say that, just reminded me. So when my son was really small, I used to put him in a daycare, a Jewish daycare near our home, mainly because as a Muslim, to me, obviously, we share a lot in common with the Jewish community. And I thought, there'd be similar values shared. And I was happy with everything that, the care levels, everything was great, except I came in one day and they were coloring in, you guessed it, the Israeli flag.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was so distressed. I was so distressed because I really had no reproaches at all. They were such lovely ladies who were taking care of the kids, and I was so grateful. But I was just there. How do I broach the fact that I did not sign up for that?
Right. How old was your son at this age?
So he was there until under the age of 2. They were
So
taking them,
yeah,
yeah,
they
yeah,
start early. They
yeah,
start very, very early, and that's how it works.
yeah.
And it's been very successful in indoctrinating a lot of people.
Yeah. And so how does your public position, your family's, I should say, public position on this issue impact your relationship to the wider community? Because I've heard from a lot of friends who have spoken out about this and others who don't, by the way, for this exact reason, that there's a price that you pay internally for challenging the narrative on Israel.
Well, I mean, we've always been in a unique position that way. I mean, first of all, in my family at least, there's no consideration of the price. It's just a moral duty. I mean, this state, which is now turned genocidal, founded on ethnic cleansing, it commits its crimes in our name. And so it's just our duty as Jewish people and as North Americans who foot the bill, because Israel couldn't do what it does without Western support, especially of the US, but Canada and the UK and other NATO states as well. So it's just a duty. So that's just how we've always seen it. It's a moral obligation. And I'll be honest with you, there's a part of me that likes confrontation. Like, and I like, I I just feel compelled to stand up for what I believe in.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have friends who I haven't seen for the best part of the last 19 months. And some of them have just even said to me, like, I just don't feel like it would be appropriate for me to invite you to
Yeah.
this event, which is a gathering with friends I grew up with. I grew up in North London, which has a big Jewish community here in London. So, and that's been an interesting kind of development to observe in terms of our sort of interpersonal relationships and the impact of the conflict on that. I know that I'm not the same person today than I was 19 months ago. I genuinely feel like my DNA has been altered by the horrors that we've been seeing day in, day out. And I just was wondering how the last 19 months have impacted you, your worldview. Has anything changed fundamentally for you? You've always been skeptical of empire and its reach, of the military industrial complex, but has there been any new layers added?
Well, that's a hard question. I always knew that Israel was a uniquely evil state in the world today. Apartheid South Africa is no more, but we still have this one apartheid colony that has been engaged in this ethnic cleansing process for now, well, over 77 years. And I guess I never thought, even though I know how just cynical and evil Israel is as a state, I didn't think that I'd be ever seeing this. And I guess that was naive of me because I do know the history of Israel. I know how it begins. It's founded on ethnic cleansing. Um, it's been engaged in that project for its entire history. It's killed tens of thousands of people well before October 7th, put millions under a brutal, harsh military occupation. And so I guess I felt I don't know, embarrassed, but I felt like I should have seen this coming, and I didn't. I just thought, I guess, what I feel. What I feel guilty about is that in the period before October 7th, I had kind of disengaged from the Palestine issue. I wasn't as involved as I had been in earlier parts of my life, because I felt as if just the Palestinian cause had been not permanently defeated, but certainly neutralized for a very, very long time, and it just didn't seem like there was any hope, and so therefore no point in investing. So I felt guilty that I disengaged, and I felt guilty that I didn't fully grasp just how evil this state is. Um, and I certainly lost whatever faith I had left in our, Western democracy and our ability to be able to make change through grassroots pressure. Yeah, I certainly lost that.
Mm.
Because how can you look at what's happening, just the level of um, the horrors that are happening to Gaza? It's impossible even to articulate, and see our Western leaders, our media line up to support it and to whitewash it. It completely destroyed whatever faith, and that was very little I had left in our system.
I'd be very interested personally to see a poll of, public trust in all the major institutions that are so foundational to a democracy functioning today. Because I suspect that we are at a state of, deeply dysfunctional. That might even be a kind characterization of dysfunctional democracy. But you mentioned you described Israel as kind of uniquely evil, and I just wanted to delve into that because, of course, one of the criticisms that we hear is that there's a sort of obsession with Israel, that Israel is held to a different standard to other states, that we're all obsessed with Israel, that there are other states around the world doing horrific things. I'm sure you're more than familiar with this frequently touted argument. And I suppose one of the things I wanted to discuss was this idea that, in its essence, and before we even get to genocide, the Israeli state is founded on the notion of a state for Jewish people exclusively, right? And I wanted to ask you, in what sense is it for Jewish people exclusively? Because I'm still not clear, and I've read quite a bit around these issues. Do we mean Jewish people as a culture, as a religion, as an ethnic group? It can't be an ethnic group because there are Jews of all different ethnic groups. So what are we talking about? Is it based on Jewish people as a race, as in the construct of race, and so based on a kind of outmoded notion that was based in how colonial empires thought of people, separated into distinct and hierarchically organized races? I mean, what is it?
I would define it as a Jewish white European ethnic group. Yes, there are different ethnicities of Jews. If you go to Israel, you'll see that the Sephardic people and African Jews, they're not treated as well. There's a certain level of racism even against them, although there are Sephardic Jews in the government. But in terms of who has always been at the power structure inside Israel, it's been the Western European, Eastern European Jews
Hmm.
that constitute the power structure. So yeah, that's how I would define it, as a European Jewish ethno state on Arab land.
And so obviously, historically, Jewish people within Europe, obviously at the turn of the century, are identified outside the realms of whiteness, right? This is the beginning of the identification of Jews as somehow separate and different. This idea of a fifth column, which eventually, is compounded by dehumanization and takes us to the horrors of the Holocaust. Um, Today, do you think Jewish people continued to be viewed as this racial other in the same way? And I ask this because you may be familiar with the journalist and author Rennie Edo-Lodge, who wrote "Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race." But in her book, she makes a distinction between prejudice and racism, right? Prejudice is like a dislike of a people for various reasons, and racism, which is structural, by which I mean that the effects of prejudice compounded with power, so prejudice plus power, lead to negative outcomes for that group at various stages of society. Today, and I don't mean historically, because historically, clearly, Jews were the subject of racism. Today, do you think Jews experience racism?
No, and of course, and I think the leading promoters of this notion that Jews are othered are now powerful Jews themselves, who are constantly portraying themselves as victims, and everything under the sun is anti-Semitic. The other day, I heard a Jewish CNN anchor, Dana Bash, say that Free Palestine now should be considered possibly an anti-Semitic term. So it's establishment Jewish people that are constantly portraying themselves as being the targets and being othered because they want to create this fake climate of persecution to justify Israel's existence, because Israel can't exist without Jews around the world being scared and feeling as if they're unsafe and have nowhere else to go. So therefore, we need this fanatical ethno state to protect us, even if it means, killing tens of thousands of people and committing ethnic cleansing. So I think to the extent now there's any othering of Jews, it's led by establishment Jews themselves. And that's sort of been what Zionism has been about from the start, to make the rest of the world sort of feel unsafe for Jews so that Israel can justify its existence. Because how else can you justify a supremacist ethno state?
And I guess I'm asking that question because, of course, most of the time and especially in the last 19 months, we've heard so much about anti-Semitism and rising anti-Semitism. And I observe this, of course, alongside the diminishing interest in anti-racism when it comes to other minorities, right? So the removal of DEI schemes, this sort of massive pushback against the notion of woke, if you want to call it that, but I would broadly call it an interest in understanding the experiences of minoritized communities and how that impacts their life outcomes. And I'm always curious about the ways in which anti-Semitism fits within that picture, because structural racism basically means if you're black and brown in this country, you're more likely to be born into poverty. You're more likely to live in poor housing. You're more likely to have educational failures. You're more likely to end up in a PRU. You're more likely to end up in prison. You're less likely to end up in higher education. You're more likely to be unemployed. That is not true for Jews
Yeah,
in
of
this.
course. Yeah, no, I mean, in my own experience, I think I can count one time when I was a kid, someone said one anti-Semitic thing to me. But this idea that we're discriminated against when, Jews occupy so many powerful positions where it's impossible to criticize the Israeli state without being canceled now, and people want to complain as if Jews are a persecuted minority. I think it's embarrassing. It's also an insult, by the way, to the victims of the Nazi Holocaust who experienced actual persecution. And my father's grandparents were murdered at Auschwitz. And whenever I hear prominent, powerful Jews now complain about how persecuted they are, I think they're also insulting the legacy of my family and all the victims of the Nazi Holocaust. And I find it embarrassing that there's still this hysteria over anti-Semitism. And there's so many examples of it being weaponized way before October 7th. I mean, look at Jeremy Corbyn here. I'm still so bitter about what happened to Jeremy Corbyn because, for me, living in the West, he was like our greatest hope, an actual principled leader with a progressive agenda, not just on Palestine, but for, all of society. And he was attacked in the most cynical way by people who weaponize anti-Semitism to destroy him. So that's the main function of discussions of anti-Semitism now. It's to silence people who are critical of power, whether it's not just Israel, but also anybody like Jeremy Corbyn who represents a threat to the establishment.
The Jeremy Corbyn situation is one that requires, I think, a sort of deep dive examination, probably into an entire episode, because there were, of course, Jewish members of the Labour Party who claimed that Jeremy Corbyn was not addressing sufficiently some of their concerns around anti-Semitism. And some of these were things that I do think require us to have an open discussion around. There was a mural, for example, that he was stood in front of where he was accused of sort of endorsing anti-Semitic imagery. If you go back to the image, it does certainly look like a group of wealthy men around a table, around a crystal ball that represents the earth. And it certainly plays on this notion that there are wealthy people controlling the planet. Did I see anything personally there that I recognize? Maybe I'm just not well educated enough to recognize the signs of anti-Semitism. But there were people in the Labour Party, for example, who felt that there wasn't sufficient attention being given to these concerns.
I can say this, I have Jewish privilege. I have no time for those people. I just don't. Who then, turn whatever individual complaints they might have about certain situations, you turn this into this massive scandal that's being talked about constantly in the media, and Jeremy Corbyn constantly has to answer for. It was all, to me, an obvious scam to undermine the best hope that progressives had in the Western world for a genuine leader who could reach masses and help the masses. And I'm still mad about it because, look, I know someone who considers himself a progressive, very, very progressive, and works in media, and said to me, Aaron, you don't know what it was like to be a Jew sitting in synagogue in during Jeremy Corbyn's time. And I just like, what do I say to that? To me, there's a psychological issue here going on where people convince themselves that they're being persecuted, and I just don't have time for it when
Mm.
we're talking about privileged people, and we're talking about um, in a society where there are actual persecuted people, and I just don't count privileged Jews as in that category.
And just to clarify, when you say privileged Jews comprise only 2% of the US population, but fully 30% of the 100 richest Americans, and they enjoy the highest household income among all religious groups. Jews comprise less than 0.2% of the world's population, but of the world's 200 richest people, 20% are Jewish. And I
Yeah,
also do want to caveat that by saying that there are Orthodox Jewish communities that are much poorer. And
sure,
I do think because they are visibly Jewish in a way that a lot of Jews are
absolutely,
indistinguishable from white people, do experience forms of prejudice that become racism
of
because of their
course.
identifiable identity.
No one would deny that there's anti-Semitism in the world. Of course, there is, just like every form of prejudice. But the question is, to what extent is it a problem? And is it is the problem of it being weaponized to serve different ends? And you can't look objectively at what's happening and not see a massive exploitation of the very real legacy of anti-Semitism to serve very cynical ends. And there's just so many examples in the U.S. Two members of Congress coming from black working class backgrounds, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, they signed on to resolutions early on calling for a ceasefire, and they're critical of Israel. And AIPAC, the main Israel lobby group, got together and spent more than $23 million to oust them from Congress, and they bragged about it. There's so many examples we can go through. So, I mean, that is happening, and we can't deny it. A university presidents last year in the U.S., they were fired because they didn't sufficiently crack down on pro-Palestine protests in the eyes of Jewish billionaire donors. So when that's happening, to call that out is not to, um, you know, assign these actions to an ethnic group. It's to assign these actions to a small class of people within that ethnic group that are using their power for very cynical ends.
So you're saying that they're using Judaism as a cover for their political
I am
objectives.
saying that,
Yeah,
yes.
and I tread sensitively there
I
because
understand.
of course there are many people who would say that the notion of a small group of Jews, exercising undue influence on the political sphere is itself a form of anti-Semitic trope. I mean, what would you say to that?
It's true. I mean, unfortunately, these Jewish billionaires are proving the stereotype. What else am I supposed to conclude when they're colluding, when they're using their financial power, and they're bragging about it? It's very, very open, and it's them that are ultimately pushing these anti-Semitic stereotypes by embodying them. And I just can't mute my criticism of that. I can't pretend it's not happening.
Now, in a recent video, former senior advisor to Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, said the following: the number one enemy to the people in Israel are American Jews that do not support Israel and do not support MAGA. The biggest single enemy to the Jewish people are not the Islamic supremacists. The
Mm.
biggest enemy you have is inside the wire. Progressive Jewish billionaires that are funding all this stuff. They are the number one enemy, and the people of Israel have to set them right. What do you make of that statement?
Well, it speaks to one of the ironies of all this is that some of the biggest purveyors of this anti-Semitism, fear-mongering, are themselves anti-Semites. Steve Bannon is showing his contempt for North American Jews who don't bow down to Israel. He's saying that, you're a threat because for them, Judaism is inseparable from Israel, which is in itself an anti-Semitic belief that your entire, ethnic religious identity is defined by this foreign state. I mean, that's anti-Semitic. And their whole fundamental ideology is anti-Semitic because people like Steve Bannon come from a Christian fundamentalist background, which basically wants to use Israel for the rapture, in which Jews will be killed except those who convert. That's their ultimate vision. That's why they want to have a militarized uh, Israeli state, is because they think it will hasten the rapture. The founder of the group Christians United for Israel, one of the major Zionist evangelical Christian groups, John Hagee, he said that the Nazi Holocaust was God's way to bring the Jews closer to the promised land. So for him, the Nazi Holocaust serves a positive end because it brings Jews closer to Israel. So that's who we're dealing with. These are anti-Semitic fanatics who want to not only, kill Palestinians and delight at that, but also want to ultimately bring about the destruction of Jews. So for people who don't go along with that, whether you're Jewish or not, to somehow be accused of anti-Semitism, it's lunacy, but that's the culture we're currently in.
And it's more than just a culture, it's increasingly policy. In October last year, the Heritage Foundation launched Project Esther, which is a so-called national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. It's now in full swing, targeting pro-Palestine activists, accusing them of being part of a Hamas support network, including, of course, the very typical subjects of Hamas propaganda, Jewish Elders for Peace, and other Jewish peace groups, natural
Of
bedfellows, of
course.
course, for Hamas. Um, I I'm really curious, Aaron, about how we, as a public, as the media, have swallowed the notion that the Heritage Foundation, which have been working systematically to dismantle the rights of other minority groups. I'm talking about DEI schemes. I'm talking about anything that supports Black and brown people, trans people, women's rights. Why would we believe for a second that they care about Jewish safety?
Well, of course they don't. I mean, the Heritage Foundation, again, that's another example of a Zionist agenda being pushed by Christian fundamentalists who ultimately want to see Jews destroyed one day. So that's their agenda. They just want to push this fear mongering to ultimately uh, strengthen the Israeli state and hopefully one day bring upon the rapture. That's their agenda. And so there's no reason at all to trust them. And one irony of all this is these are also the people on the right who went at the forefront of mocking so-called woke culture, right? Identity politics. And, they make fun of college kids who say, I don't feel safe by this word. And, I do think there is a critique to be had there. I do think in some ways there are aspects of identity culture, whatever you want to call it, that went a little bit too far and trampled on free speech. But these people on the right have taken that and put it on steroids. Like, I don't recall under the Democrats people being deported for having anti-DEI views, for example. But that's what Trump is doing. Literally, the Trump administration, they're kidnapping foreign students and deporting them for doing things like signing op-eds, as is what happened to Rameza Öztürk, who was kidnapped and set for deportation because she wrote an op-ed calling for divestment from Israel in line with a vote at her own school. So this is woke, so-called, whatever you want to call it, woke culture, cancel culture on steroids, because they're criminalizing criticism of Israel and making people face serious criminal penalties for it.
Now, some people might argue, and I know that you are one of them, that political instrumentalization of anti-Semitism actually makes Jews less safe by sort of conflating Judaism and the Jewish community with the actions of the Israeli state, which, of course, for the vast majority of people today are highly objectionable. Um, but we just saw two Israeli staffers killed by a gunman in DC while leaving an event outside the Capital Jewish Museum. That the suspect in that incident said, "I did it for Gaza, free, free Palestine." It's largely being reported as an anti-Semitic event. Who do you blame for that attack?
Well, it's very obvious to me if there wasn't a genocide going on, there wouldn't have been that murder. That's if the alleged shooter's manifesto is correct, he did this because he was motivated by the genocide. And that's what happens when people are treated to, more than a year and a half of a live stream genocide and they see complete impunity for it. I think in this case, he thought he was taking justice. Now, I don't condone killing anybody. I value all human life. But that's the problem here, is that we're in a society right now in which Palestinian lives just do not matter, in which the slaughter of tens of thousands of people has become totally normalized. And it's not surprising to me that in that context, some people snap and take things way too far. There was also Aaron Bushnell, the U.S. Army veteran who burned himself alive in an act of protest. That's what happens to people. I have to assume, I shouldn't assume, I have to wonder if there's some mental instability here. And in a climate like this, where you're seeing this horrific atrocity and no accountability for it, people take harsh action. And if we value the lives of human beings equally, we would mourn these two Israelis, because I don't want to see anybody killed, but how can we then spend the amount of tension that we spend on these two people when tens of thousands of people have been slaughtered in Gaza are still being killed every single day. On the same day that these two Israelis were killed, dozens of Palestinians were killed in Gaza. You can't even keep track of all the atrocities anymore. It's impossible because there's so many happening every single day.
And I guess one of the other parts of the current discourse, which sort of shuts down any criticism of Israel in the name of anti-Semitism, is that it also gives significant cover to the US, far right, and not just the American far right, the far right across Europe, who sort of hide behind their defense of Israel as sort of giving them carte blanche to promote extremely hostile and dangerous ideas about many minority groups. And in some cases, you often also hear them slip up privately around certain comments around the Jewish community too. I think of equalities as an equivalence, right? So the protection of one minority group's rights
Yeah.
protects the rights of other minorities, right? That's why we care, because actually in protecting them, we protect ourselves, which is selfish, but that's how it works. And I'm wondering how those who are genuinely concerned about anti-Semitism, I'm not talking about the people here who, we know are ideologically driven, have been sent, maybe even paid to promote this discourse. But there are people who have this fear that there is this growing anti-Semitism and that they're under attack and that these things need to happen to protect the Jewish community. How have people accepted the notion that protecting the Jews can come at the detriment of any other group?
Because they've been successfully propagandized into buying into the Israeli project, which requires you to accept that Jewish supremacy is okay, that it's all right to have a state that is defined not as a state of its people, but as a state of the Jewish people, and that was founded on stealing Palestinian land and forcing them into exile. That has to be the structure you buy into in order to justify Israel's continued existence and Israel's continued actions. And, if you read the work of Norman Finkelstein, he points out that this sort of acceptance of Israel and this buying into the Israeli project in a Western context, it didn't really happen in the years after 1948 when Israel was founded. It really ramped up after 1967 when Israel became a U.S. proxy, when Israel stole the West Bank, Gaza, and other Arab land and began serving U.S. imperial interests. And so after 1967, Norman points out, to be a supporter of Israel meant also that you were further embedded within the Western power establishment. So it was a way whether you're Jewish or not, of assimilating further into the power structure, because Israel after that point became a tool of U.S. imperialism. So there's also just a power motive here. It's not just about people believing in ethno supremacy. It's also about power and privilege within the U.S. imperial structure.
I want to ask you about a quote by the Palestinian writer and activist Mohammed El Kurd. He recently wrote on X, and I quote, "Just in case you didn't know, Israel has a right to exist, in inverted brackets, is a racist anti-Palestinian dog whistle, which implies the extermination of the Palestinian people. It was crafted and popularized by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and repeating it today as a genocide is waged is especially egregious and akin to saying Nazi Germany had a right to exist while it was carrying out the Holocaust." So, Aaron, firstly, your reaction to that comment and also to this notion that Israel has a right to exist.
Well, no states have the right to exist. States have rights as part of their existence, but part of your rights means respecting other people's rights, and Israel's never done that. It's founded on ethnic cleansing, and it's been determined to steal more land and kill more Palestinians, more Arabs ever since. So, and the history of this term, Israel has the right to exist, according to Noam Chomsky, it really ramped up in the early 1970s. And that's when you saw the PLO, then under the leadership of Yasser Arafat and other Arab states, starting to realize that, okay, Israel's here. We're not going to be able to get rid of it. And so to be pragmatic, we need to come around to accepting a Palestinian state and a compromise. So accepting a Palestinian state in just 22% of our historic homeland, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. You have moves toward this in the 1970s. And that's when Chomsky says, Israel started saying, okay, if they're going to make peace with us, they have to accept our right to exist, which was a deliberately crafted term to impose on Palestinians and Arab states a condition they could never accept. Because if you're Palestinian, why should you accept someone's right to exist on your stolen land? I mean, we don't ask Native Americans in the U.S. to accept the right of the U.S. to exist, but we do ask that everyone accepts that the U.S. exists. So if Israel had said, okay, we're willing to make peace with you, we just want you to accept our existence within our recognized borders, the Arab states and the PLO, and even recently Hamas, were willing to do that. Hamas was never willing to formally recognize Israel, but Hamas was willing to formally recognize a two-state solution in which they accepted a very big compromise, just 22% of their historic homeland. It's only Israel, with U.S. backing, that's refused to accept its own recognized borders because it wants to steal Palestinian land and wants to deny them, it wants to deny Palestinian self-determination. So in short, this concept of Israel's right to exist, it's a carefully crafted, cynical statement designed to make it impossible for peace, because Israel would rather have supremacy and conquest than peace in the region. And by the way, when has Israel ever said we accept Palestine's right to exist? And when are Israeli supporters ever called upon to say we accept Palestine's right to exist? Israel already exists. It has recognized borders that it doesn't even respect itself, because it steals more Palestinian land and now destroys Gaza. But no Israeli has ever challenged to say, do you accept Palestine's right to exist, even though Palestine doesn't exist yet, and it's actually being destroyed right now. So just in that contrast right there, you have Palestinians and their allies constantly being implored to, attest, I accept Israel's right to exist. But yet no Israeli or no Israel supporter ever can come out and even say, I accept Palestine's right to exist, even in theory. As in practice, it's being actively destroyed. It speaks to just the huge racist hypocrisy that underpins that concept of Israel's right to exist.
It is also a bit of a weird thought police thing, right? I mean, you could ask Native Americans, like, do you believe in the United States of
Yeah.
America's right to exist? I mean, surely they have a right to say no,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean that they don't still live in the
Exactly.
United States of America.
Exactly.
And I mean, you earlier on in the conversation alluded to the fact that you'd sort of stepped away prior to sort of October the 8th from Israel Palestine, largely from a sense of despair. And I think what's interesting to revisit today is that until that point, much of the discussions, whether it was in DC or here in London or in general in the sort of think tank sphere, was around the notion of a two-state solution, which, despite the reality on the ground, sort of evading any evidence of that being a logistical reality, by which I mean, of course, the expansion of settlements to the point where a sort of a territorially contiguous piece of land that could be called a state no longer really even exists in the West Bank. And so I am interested to hear where you stand today, because I think that until about 19 months ago, liberal Zionists were a big part of what was perceived to be the solution, right? And it was the idea that actually, there could be a two-state solution. There'd be a sort of, Zionist Israeli state on one end, and some form of, who knows how, because we can't really even see it, Palestinian state, maybe just a fictional one, who knows. But that was the idea. 19 months on, with everything we've seen, with everything everyone now knows about this ethno-nationalist state, about the ethnic cleansing, about the genocide, can we ever even go back to those discussions? And where do liberal Zionists fit within that picture today?
All right. Well, what I'm going to say is not what I think most people in my circle believe. And I also understand why, especially a Palestinian, could never accept it. But I still think that a Palestinian state is still the only possibly realistic option. I would love it if Israel did not exist. I do not think it has the right to exist. I mean, no state has the right to exist. They have rights if they exist, but there's no inherent right of Israel to steal Palestinian land. I would never accept that. And Israel has shown that as a state project, it's just fundamentally evil and can only continue by carrying out genocide. So I would love it if there was no Israel, but unfortunately, there is an Israel, and they have nuclear weapons, and they have the backing of the US, and I just don't see a way. I don't see what the path is toward dismantling the Israeli state. If there was one, I would endorse it in a second, but I just don't see what it is. So given that they have nuclear weapons, given that they are recognized by the United Nations, I just don't see a path to defeating them militarily and, forcing upon that land what there should be, which is just equal rights for everybody. Obviously, that's what I support is, a free Palestine from the river to the sea. I just don't know how that happens. And given that I don't know how that happens, I do still think that I don't want to take the idea of a two-state solution off the table because I just don't see any other feasible thing on this planet. I would love it if I were wrong that one day, Palestinians could achieve their liberation and there be no Israel, but I just don't see a path to it. And so that's why I still think I don't abandon that conversation of a two-state solution because I just don't see the alternative. And it is still the global consensus. Like every year at the UN, there's a vote, and everybody around the world except for Israel and the US supports the idea of a two-state solution. So given that that's what's on the table, I personally don't abandon it.
So, but you could argue that historically other states were in similar positions, as in we, would have thought maybe that South Africa could never be dismantled. We could think of Algeria and other colonial states that could never have imagined, France ending their occupation. And I wonder, today, I think there's a widespread acknowledgement of the fact that Israel's foundations are racist in nature, that its structure is not that of a democracy, but of an ethno-nationalist state. It's an apartheid state, according to Amnesty International and others. You really think that after all this time, we can go back to just Israel existing as an apartheid state and life just goes on? There's just a big part of me that feels that it's gone too far. We've seen too much. We cannot, as an international community, continue to do business with, accept the notion of a state founded on a notion of racial supremacy that's even built into the foundations of the state and the way it's structured. How do we continue that?
I agree with you, but if I can't articulate to you how we achieve that end goal of dismantling Israel, then to me, it's a fool's errand to continue to advocate for it because what will continue to happen is Israel will use this refusal by the world to accept it to continue ethnically cleansing and push not just the Palestinians out of Gaza, which it's doing now, but then turn to the West Bank.
Mm.
And so that's why I just think the most pragmatic solution in that context is to push for something that might have a chance of at least keeping Palestinians in the West Bank now in their homes, in their homeland. It's that crazy. They have nuclear weapons, and look, they're worse than apartheid South Africa. There's no doubt about that. Israel's worse than apartheid South Africa. Internally, inside Israel, I mean, I would argue that the status of Palestinians inside Israel now, inside 1948, is better than it was for blacks in apartheid South Africa. But in the West Bank and Gaza, obviously, it's much worse than apartheid. I mean, Archbishop Desmond Tutu said the same thing. Of course, it's much worse. And to reverse that, I don't see a path other than advocating for at least the Palestinians to have somewhat of a homeland in their homeland that was stolen from them. I just don't. If there was a path to it, I'd sign up for it in a second. I just don't see what it is.
So you'll still be advocating for the two-state solution in Washington circles, even after everything that's said and done.
Well, I can't say I'm advocating for it. I'm just not going to rule it out.
And I guess, who do you see today even capable of laboring or midwifing this two-state solution? Because I was listening to you on another podcast, and one of the comments that was being made was about the US sort of brokering a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. And one of the issues I think you raised was like, how can the US, which is like an interested party, broker a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia? It makes no sense. And then how, the US is essentially the only player that can, put Israel on a leash, as I regularly use the term. America and Israel are essentially allied. I mean, if the US is not going to midwife a peace process, who actually has the ability to do that?
Well, US policy would have to change. And I don't want to rule that out. Maybe I'm naive. I still want to believe that possibly, at least in theory, the US is a democracy and there is widespread disgust at Israel. So it's possible on this planet that maybe one day, maybe not anytime soon, but maybe one day US policy could change if there was enough public support behind it and if Israel became enough of a liability. I draw some hope in the fact that the younger generation that I see in the West, here in the UK, in North America, They're not as fanatic as the old generation. They're not as intimidated by the allegations of anti-Semitism, and they see Israel for what it is. And this older generation will not be in power forever. You know, the Chuck Schumers, the Joe Bidens, the Donald Trumps, they're going to be gone. And maybe the next generation of people will be less extreme in their support of Israel. In Israel, I don't see any hope whatsoever. That's a society which is really unique in that the younger generation is more extreme than the older generation, which is scary.
Mm,
But that's what
absolutely.
Israel is. And I have no hope of ever swaying Israelis, melting their hearts. And, you know, they're to me a lost cause. To
Mm.
me, that's just a fundamentally corrupted society based on their entire genealogy, like founded on ethnic cleansing, founded on crimes, founded on denial. To me, Israel is irredeemable, but I don't have that same pessimism when it comes to the
The
rest of the
younger
world.
generation.
Yeah.
I think what's really interesting is, despite all the criticism we see of identity politics and work culture, is that one thing it did do really well was make sure that the younger generation are quite sensitive
Yes.
to the rights of minoritized groups
Yeah.
and care how other people are treated, care about equalities. And, I often think that there's now a generation of some of the brightest young people of, here in the UK, in the US, and across the world, who, will be graduating from Cambridge and from Columbia and from Harvard and elsewhere, who will not forget that their universities, that their government unleashed extreme violence on them for simply denouncing a genocide. And so I do think that you're right in that sense, that there will be a reckoning that will come, because eventually those people will work up the ranks. That's the point of going to Cambridge or Oxford or Columbia or elsewhere. And you don't easily erase watching your friends during the formative years of your identity being beaten the crap out of, frankly, to put it bluntly. Um, Look, apparently there's a shift happening. And I want to ask you a little bit about what credence you give to that. The last 19 months, we've all been gaslit, Palestinians first and foremost, about what's been happening to them. And suddenly, within the last, few days, week, we have seen everyone have
Yeah.
the revelation,
Yeah.
Aaron.
Yeah.
They've seen it.
Yeah.
They see what's happening.
Yeah.
And it's awful. And now they know. I'm just wondering, why did the deaths of conservative figure 17,000 children blown to bits? You and I and so many others have watched, you know, bodies in bags because they couldn't even be recognized because of the harm done to these people. Why are they drawing the line on starvation? Why is starvation the tipping point? Everything else we could take. Bomb them, blockade them, but starvation, ribs, we don't want to be seeing the ribs.
It's a great question. It comes down to PR, to public relations. If you're carrying out mass murder by bombing every single day a defenseless death camp, Israel could always say, well, Hamas fighters were there in the vicinity. That was the constant line. We're just defending ourselves. And Western politicians were willing to buy that Israel is just defending itself. Hamas uses human shields. But when Israeli leaders started saying, yeah, we're imposing a starvation siege, we're not letting in any food and medicine, and the images started coming out, just for public relations purposes, that became untenable. And Netanyahu even said, he said, we're going to let in a small amount of aid, a token amount of aid, so that we can continue doing what we're doing, because some US politicians were coming to us and saying we can't have these images of mass starvation. He didn't say we can't have mass starvation. He said we can't have the images of mass starvation, because they don't want those images reaching the public that's footing the bill. So this is just finally, after a year and a half, finally they feel they have a public relations crisis, and so have to do some token gestures in response.
But this is the bit that's weird to me because, firstly, public relations crisis. I mean, are you not on TikTok? Are you not on Instagram? Because the rest of us have been knee deep, neck deep in the Israeli PR crisis for 19
Yeah.
months. So clearly, it's not like the majority of people under 40, because we've all been seeing that. We've
Yeah.
been seeing the photos. It's
Yeah.
been public. So what is it that we're seeing now? Or it's just the notion that the bombs were justifiable because you could create some confusion, even though it was repeatedly debunked that the hospitals somehow were secret bunkers,
Exactly.
now they've targeted every single hospital in Gaza, and fairy tale stories for each of those targetings. But you're saying that the sort of starvation is the line because it shows a deliberate
Yeah.
attempt at
Yeah.
genocide. So it's an internal legal memo. Is that what it is?
Yes.
It's now been circulated because I mean, even Malala,
Yeah.
has now spoken out.
Yes.
And it almost feels like a memo's been circulated. It's been like, hey
It's
guys,
okay now.
yeah, just to
Yeah.
let you know,
Yeah.
it's okay now. And
Yeah.
you see it on Sky News, you see it on people,
Yeah.
journalists who were a few months ago, out here saying, when are we going to see Sinwar's head on a plate? I was messaging these people privately and saying, Sinwar's head on a plate? Who are you? Are you the Taliban? Just wondering, because I thought we were journalists and
Yeah.
this is not really how we talk about military operations, regardless of your personal feelings about them. Um, so so what is it? It's a memo?
Yeah, it's a memo, and I just think we finally reached that breaking point for some people where they just couldn't pretend anymore. When Israel would drop a bomb, they always would say, "We're targeting a Hamas command center. We're targeting Hamas militants, even if they killed hundreds of civilians or dozens of civilians in the vicinity." They would say that the media would just write it down and move on to the next atrocity and repeat that over and over and over. Finally, when you have Israeli government openly bragging about mass starvation and imposing mass starvation and the images, I think we finally hit that point. It's so humiliating that look, from the first day, Israel never had a right to fire a single bullet into Gaza. They're the occupying power. Occupiers don't have self-defense rights. They have obligations. Their only obligation was to end the occupation. That was never the conversation. It was always about Israel's so-called right to self-defense. And unfortunately, even some people who are defenders of Palestinian rights didn't fundamentally grasp that notion that, Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself against a population that it's been attacking and bombarding for its entire existence. It has the obligation to end the occupation, and then you can have peace. But because we've normalized occupation, we've normalized apartheid, Israel's response, quote unquote, just seemed routine. So even someone like Bernie Sanders, progressive US politician who was critical of Israel, he still constantly had to repeat the mantra, Israel has the right to defend itself against Hamas. And that's because we've been so successfully indoctrinated with this notion that this is a both sides conflict. There's parity. It's nuance. It's not. It's the simplest conflict in the world. One side is the occupying aggressor. And to resolve the conflict, that occupation, that aggression has to end.
So interesting. On that note, you will have seen that Israeli soldiers literally opened fire near a group of diplomats who were visiting Jenin in the occupied West Bank in Palestine. Now, there were no casualties, but this was labeled as, deeply shocking incident. Israel called it a mistake. What does this incident tell us about the levels of impunity that have been reached? Because we both know that there's a hierarchy of diplomats, right? So yes, there were diplomats from the Middle East. We're going to consider those not in our view, but in the view of Israel,
Yeah.
as sort of category B
Yeah.
or even category C diplomats. We shoot at them occasionally. Oh
Yeah.
well. But there was sort of what we might call category A diplomats on this visit, right? People from European
Mhm.
countries, which traditionally we both know Israel has sort of been a bit more cautious
Sure.
about taking aim at. So
Yeah.
what does this tell us?
Well, it just shows the absolute contempt for human life that Israel has to the point where they feel comfortable shooting at their allies. Because when you're an occupier, that just everything is seen through the prism of just defending your occupation. And so shooting at Western diplomats becomes okay because you've been given so much impunity over the years. Israel's killed American citizens like Rachel Corrie and Shireen Abu Akleh with no consequence whatsoever, forcing American politicians to pretend as if they're outraged while doing absolutely nothing. So this is just the culture of impunity. And one point I wanted to make earlier about PR, the West has always preferred Israeli governments that were sort of from the more dovish side, like the labor governments, like Ehud Barak and Yitzhak Rabin, because even though their policies are very similar, I mean, they all commit atrocities against Palestinians, they all steal Palestinian land. The labor side of the Israeli spectrum does it while pretending to care about peace. And Netanyahu, for some people, is a liability because he's just so brazen in his contempt for Palestinian life. And that becomes a problem sometimes that has to be addressed. So you have to sometimes slap Israel on the wrist and get it to scale back. But fundamentally, the commitment in the Israeli spectrum, no matter who's in power, whether it's Netanyahu or his opposition, is to occupation, is to ethnic cleansing. And Israel's Western sponsors, especially in the U.S., just prefer that it be done with a little bit more,
Bit more
a
nuance.
little more
Bit
nuance.
more
Yeah,
nuance, a bit more smoke and mirrors.
exactly. Yeah.
Speaking of smoke and mirrors, there was a 60 Minutes interview which aired 6 months ago in which a retired Mossad agent openly bragged about how Israel manipulates public perceptions and narratives. When he was asked how Mossad managed to convince Hezbollah to buy pages that were exploded, he responded, "We create a pretend world. We are a global production company. We write the screenplays, we're the directors, we're the producers, we're the main actors. The world is our stage." What do you make of that?
Well, it makes you wonder, what else are they concocting that we don't know about, right? What films, what television series, what music groups, like what aspect of our culture that we might not know about has been corrupted by Israel? And unfortunately, I mean, it sounds paranoid, but it's a fair question now, given just how pervasive censorship has become and given how powerful pro-Israel figures are, and given how cynical they are, how they constantly want to indoctrinate people into supporting their project. It just makes you paranoid. Like, what else do they have their hands in? And I understand that's why it makes people a lot more paranoid and a lot more prone to embrace theories that are baseless, because the world seems so crazy. You need something to cling to make sense of it.
Right. And I mean, you probably saw that Israel came second at the Eurovision
Eurovision, yes, yeah,
contest. And there are
yeah.
reports that this was largely thanks to an aggressive digital campaign run by the Israeli government advertising agency. Basically, the campaign ran a load of ads telling users to call all 20 of their votes for the Israeli entry, which is not technically against Eurovision rules, but it does raise some questions. I think my main question is, why does Israel care so much about winning Eurovision? Because I'll be honest, who actually watches Eurovision? No shade to those who do, but I mean, why do they care?
Well, Israel doesn't have much of a culture. If you think about, like, have you ever heard a funny Israeli comedian? Or, I mean, I can't think of one, and that makes sense. I mean, because it's not just because it's a relatively recent state, it's because it's founded on such an evil way that I think that will corrupt a state, and that will spread throughout society. So it hasn't produced much for the world to really enjoy. It just produced a lot of death and suffering. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that to sort of uh, attract some cultural currency, it resorts to rigging, and that's what it's used to. It's used to deceptions and cynical actions to advance its agenda, and it's used to stealing culture. I mean, that's what so much of Israeli culture is it's stealing. It's premised on stealing Palestinian culture.
Have you seen the Israeli kafir?
I have not seen the Israeli
Dear
Kafir.
Lord. Dear Lord.
Yeah.
The Tea is a fully independent, nonpartisan production. No corporate ties here, just a small, dedicated team working hard to bring you honest, impactful conversations. If you believe in our work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click on that subscribe button now and join us as a Patreon. You'll find the link in our bio. I want to ask you about something that's quite contentious. So, 3 weeks ago, Spain cancelled a $7.5 million arms deal with Israel. Days later, there was a mysterious blackout, which crippled Spain, Portugal. The airports were down, the hospitals, the metro, all shut down. Then, a few days ago, just weeks after the first blackout, Spain faced another outage in its telecommunications. This time, all major phone networks briefly went down across the country. And later that day, the Spanish Congress of Deputies approved a non binding motion urging the government to impose a total arms embargo on Israel. Coincidence, I'm sure. There's a lot of speculation online about this being a cyber attack. Um, what's your take?
I haven't looked into it, but it's fair to assume that Israel's guilty these days. It is. It's fair to assume that, given just how horrible they've been in Gaza and how cynical they are in safeguarding their mass murder campaign. It wouldn't surprise me at all. They have such contempt for people who stand up to them. They have so much contempt for anybody who dares defy them that, so for example, Barack Obama, you know, their chief patron in Washington, when he was negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran back in 2015, Netanyahu came to Congress and gave a speech, trying to undermine him. So they hate and they feel they're so entitled. There's a real entitlement in that political culture. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all. I just assume in these cases that, yeah, Israel is guilty until proven innocent.
Well, you'd be aligned with many people online, but of course, we have no evidence currently to substantiate that, I do have to say. So now let me ask you a little bit about Hamas, because for years the US refused to deal directly with Hamas and left those negotiations to countries like Qatar and Egypt, who get a lot of slack for it. But now we're seeing the Trump administration directly negotiate with Hamas. And during his recent visit to the Middle East, he surprisingly, the US directly negotiated with Hamas to secure the release of the US Israeli soldier Eden Alexander. Is the direct negotiations with Hamas a positive thing?
I initially thought that it was, but now I suspect that it's another con by the Trump administration. Back in March, there were talks between Adam Boehler, who was Trump's hostage envoy, and Hamas. And Adam Boehler went on TV and he said that we made great progress. And he actually thought that the Hamas officials he met with were nice guys. And he also said that Hamas was not just talking about a captive exchange, but also a long-term truce, and that there's a possibility of a real long-term resolution here to this conflict. And in response to Israeli complaints about him talking to Hamas, Adam Boehler said, well, we're not an agent of Israel. We're the United States. We make our own decisions. Well, for saying that, he got basically reprimanded. Netanyahu had a freak out, and he withdrew from public appearances after that, because you just don't say in Washington, we're not an agent of Israel, where to get ahead in Israel, to get ahead in Washington, you actually do have to act as a de facto agent of Israel. And then those talks were revived a few months later, and they were successful, but Hamas didn't get anything for it. And what they said since is that they did this as an act of good faith to release Aaron Alexander, and that Trump's envoy had promised them that if they do that, Trump will then call for an end to the blockade and for an immediate ceasefire, which Trump did not do. So if that Hamas account is correct, then Trump played Hamas, and therefore you can't say that the negotiations were positive, and you can't say that that the reported rift between Trump and Netanyahu was real. That to the extent there was a rift, it was a scam. Basically, for Aaron Alexander to get freed, Trump can claim victory, and Israel can continue carrying out mass murder.
And the timing of the alleged rift was pretty convenient. Trump was doing his tour of the Middle East. He was going to see a number of very wealthy Arab states that were obviously to sign eventually $1 trillion deal with America. So, the smoke and mirrors could have value at that particular point. But I think there'll be a lot of people, particularly on the right, who would applaud Trump for, quote unquote, not negotiating with terrorists, lying to Hamas about getting Eden Alexander out in exchange for a ceasefire and an end to the blockade. But there are much more serious consequences, aren't there, Aaron, to reneging on the terms of a negotiated agreement like this one? And I'm thinking in particular, not just with regards to the long-term negotiations that need to happen for a ceasefire and a peace deal, which is obviously where this always has to end, but also maybe even for the negotiations with Iran.
Well, exactly. Iran must be watching all this and wondering if they can trust the U.S. now, after allegedly the U.S. reneged on this agreement with Hamas, and especially after the U.S. has been changing its tune about what they want out of these negotiations. Initially, Steve Witkoff, who was Trump's top envoy, said that the US would be fine with some level of Iranian enrichment, which was the case with the previous Iran nuclear deal that Trump killed in his first term. But then again, after a freak out from pro-Israel neocon forces, he retracted that. And now he says our red line is any enrichment. And for Iran, that's their red line because they insist on the right to enrich. So certainly Trump blowing up this agreement with Hamas, getting Edon Alexander freed, and then not offering Palestinians anything, that will certainly make these Iran negotiations more difficult.
And, there's some speculation that I think, Trump may be looking at that as his Nobel Peace Prize entry application. So he may well have shot himself in the foot in that sense. Um, what hope do you hold with regards to a negotiated ceasefire given where we sit today?
I don't hold any hope. I have to be honest. Hamas has no leverage because Israel doesn't care about its own people. I think Hamas, when they carried out October 7th, first of all, I think they were more successful than they anticipated. They didn't expect Israeli defenses to be so weak. And one of the reasons why Israeli defenses were weak is because Netanyahu had diverted forces to the occupied West Bank, because that's what he really cares about. That's why Israel so-called disengaged from Gaza in 2005 by pulling out the settlers, because they really care about stealing land in the occupied West Bank. And I think Hamas thought that they would take soldiers and then use them to exchange prisoners. That was the goal. And also, the former Israeli defense minister, Yoav Gallant, said also Hamas was talking about ending the occupation, that Hamas was again calling for a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. Israel's never going to do that. Israel doesn't see Palestinians as equal human beings, and it can't tolerate any act of resistance. And so therefore, it's more important for them to kill even their own people and leave them to die in Gaza than it is to negotiate with Palestinians and make peace. That's why Israel also employed the Hannibal Directive on October 7th and killed their own people. I don't know how many, but certainly some, because they'd rather kill their own people than negotiate a captive exchange with Hamas. That's the Israeli attitude. And I don't know if Hamas fully appreciated just how much contempt Israel has, not only for Palestinian life, but for Israeli life, that the occupation and supremacy comes above everything, including saving Israeli lives. And so given that, I don't see what leverage Hamas has, and Israel will continue to use the excuse of there being some captives left to continue out its real goal, which is to destroy Gaza and commit permanent ethnic cleansing.
Do the Gulf states hold any leverage at this point? They've just signed this big deal with Trump. They are obviously flexing at some level their financial and tech muscles. Is this a sign of a rapprochement that could be helpful to the Palestinian people? Or should we read into this that the wheels of normalization are ticking on?
Given what just happened with Trump's trip to the Middle East, I don't think they're using their leverage at all. I just don't think they have any interest in it. The Arab states have long seen Palestinians as a nuisance, just like Israel does. And I don't see them using to the extent they have any leverage, and maybe they don't, maybe it doesn't matter. But to the extent they have any leverage, I don't see them using it. I mean, Trump came to Saudi Arabia, he came to Qatar, and he came to
The UAE.
the UAE, and Gaza was barely mentioned. I think he talked once about, yeah, people are starving in Gaza, we're going to do something about it. But at least publicly, unless we're missing something behind the scenes, they didn't make it an issue. And that to me was a pretty strong sign, along with signing all these lucrative deals for Trump and giving him a fancy jet, that the Gulf states are not going to use whatever leverage they have, they're not going to use it.
Well, so it's interesting because the rumors domestically in at least some of those Gulf states are that that deal was meant to be part of leverage, to be exercised in the way of,
Let's hope so. I would love that. On the one hand, I'll take it if it's not just AIPAC, buying off US politicians, if it's people who support the Palestinian cause doing it too. I'm all for it if it can help end the genocide.
Not much evidence of it, though.
Yeah.
Clearly, during his visit was when some of the attacks actually on Gaza have become even more intense.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably not a great sign in terms of being an indication of the rapprochement with the Gulf states being something that Israel's concerned about. If
Yes.
they were, I suspect they may have been treading a little bit more carefully whilst he was, being wined and dined and welcomed by virgin girls tossing their hairs.
Yeah.
Very strange display. Not culturally strange, because culturally it's something you do domestically within your home, but in a culture where women don't typically show their hair publicly, and usually do that to greet their dads upon a welcome, it's a little odd.
Yeah.
A little bit odd.
I suspect some of these Gulf states are also afraid that if they don't toe the line, that they're going to be next.
Well, this is the fragility of castles built on sand.
Yeah.
Um, Final question to you, Aaron. There has been a lot that's happened over the last year in the Middle East. It's not just Gaza, Lebanon, Syria. Um, some might argue that there is a rewriting of the map that's happening. And I say this in the context of colonial powers writing the initial map, or literally drawing the initial map of the Middle East. Do you see a wider redrawing of the map of the Middle East occurring right now? And for those who may be hopeful that it has um, some potential for the benefit of the indigenous Arab population, what would your analysis be?
I don't see the grounds for hope right now, given just how much impunity Israel has to commit mass murder, and seems to be moving towards its own final solution of expelling most, if not all, of Gaza's 2 million people. And I think the aim is to push them onto neighboring Arab states, which will only increase the already um, precarious state that those countries are in. And in Lebanon, you have a country that suffered a lot recently. And the one force in the region that was somewhat of a deterrent to Israeli aggression, which is the Axis of Resistance, has been severely weakened. And now you have Iran possibly being the target of the next regime change campaign. So, given that I see Israeli aggression and power on the rise, I don't have much grounds for hope, because I think Israel's a threat to everybody, including itself. But I also know that humans have dealt with evil and the worst horrors throughout our existence, and I just have to believe that collectively we'll all find a way to do our best to manage it. But if I'm looking objectively at the current state of the Middle East, I don't personally see much grounds for hope.
Aaron Maté, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you so much for joining us for another episode of The Tea. If you found value in what you heard, please do subscribe, share this episode, and join us on Patreon, link in our bio. Remember, challenging the status quo starts with curiosity and courage, qualities we see in our audience every week. So stay tuned, stay engaged, and keep seeking the truth. Until next time, I'm Myriam Francois, and this has been The Tea. Take care and keep the conversation going in the comments below. Thanks for watching The Tea. Please remember to like and subscribe. And if you've made it this far, why not keep going and check out this episode?